She wasn't kidnapped. She was traded. And the most disturbing part, no one in that room thought it was wrong. There were no raised voices, no last-second protests. Just a calm exchange of terms, spoken the way people discuss property or land or a problem they're ready to erase. Her name was written once, then never spoken again. What was being settled that day wasn't her future. It was a debt, a mistake made years earlier, finally being paid for, with her. She was told it was necessary, that this was the only way, that she would be safe. Safety, after all, is an easy word to use when you're not the one being handed over. The man who received her didn't stand up when she entered the room. He didn't look surprised. He didn't ask questions. He simply nodded, as if she had arrived exactly as expected. To him, this wasn't personal. It never was. He lived in a world where people were leverage, where trust was measured in silence, and where emotional distance was the only thing that kept you alive. He had built his life on rules, rules that left no space for mercy, rules that turned hesitation into regret, and she was never meant to be an exception. At first, nothing changed. She was given a place to stay, clear boundaries, unspoken instructions, no threats, no kindness, just order. From the outside, it almost looked civilized, but appearances are careful things. She learned quickly that the quiet wasn't comfort, it was observation. Every movement noted, every habit learned, not to hurt her, but to control the environment around her. She prepared herself for fear, for cruelty, for the moment when the truth would finally reveal itself, but that moment never came. Instead, something far more unsettling took its place. Distance. He never came near her unless there was a reason, never raised his voice, never touched what he considered his responsibility. And that was when the questions began. Why keep her if she was only a transaction? Why protect her if she was only payment? Why hesitate, even once, when hesitation had never been part of his nature? She didn't notice the shift all at once. No one ever does. It showed up in small things, a meeting rescheduled, an order quietly undone, a decision delayed for reasons that didn't make sense. The house adjusted around her presence. People spoke more carefully, moved differently, and he began doing something that went against every rule he lived by. He started paying attention, not to what she did, but to who she was. And that was the moment this stopped being a simple exchange, because this wasn't about love. Not yet. It was about control meeting resistance, about power encountering something it couldn't categorize. And when the day finally came that she was meant to leave, when freedom stood within reach, he realized something that would cost him more than any enemy ever had. Letting her go wasn't just releasing an asset. It was undoing the one mistake he never saw coming. So the real question isn't whether he fell in love. It's this. What happens when a man who controls everything loses control over one choice? Why was she truly sold? What did he see in her that changed the rules he never broke? And when love finally revealed itself, would it save her, or would it destroy them both? Before there was a deal, before there was a house guarded by men who never smiled, there was a smaller world she belonged to, a world where money decided what people could afford to hope for. She grew up learning the sound of worry before she learned the sound of comfort. Bills folded and unfolded until the creases wore thin. Conversations that stopped when she entered the room, adults speaking in half sentences as if finishing the truth would make it heavier. Poverty doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it sits quietly in the corner, counting, waiting. Her family owed more than they could repay, not just money, time, favors, silence. And when the pressure became unbearable, a promise was made. Not by her, for her. She wasn't asked what she wanted. She wasn't consulted. She was informed. They told her it was an opportunity, a solution, a way out for everyone. They said her life would improve, that she would be taken care of, that sacrifice was part of growing up. And she listened. Because she had learned early that arguing didn't change outcomes, it only delayed them. She was a quiet child, the kind who noticed everything and spoke very little. She watched people more than she trusted them, learned moods, learned timing, learned when silence was safer than honesty, emotionally guarded. Not cold, just careful. Love was never part of her plans, not because she didn't believe in it, but because it felt like a luxury meant for people with options. She dreamed of escape instead, of leaving, of choosing her own mornings, of waking up somewhere no one knew her name or her history or what she owed by simply existing. Freedom was her quiet wish, not romance, not rescue, just freedom. When they told her she was being married, she accepted it with a stillness that unsettled them. Marriage at least made sense in her world. Marriage had rules people understood. But the truth arrived slowly, in fragments. There was no talk of ceremony, no mention of family introductions. No questions about compatibility or future plans. Instead, there were instructions, dates, travel arrangements made without her involvement, and then she understood. She wasn't being married. She was being delivered, handed over to fulfill an agreement she didn't create and couldn't refuse. Fear didn't come all at once. It settled in layers, in the pit of her stomach when she packed her bag, in the weight of her mother's silence, in the way goodbyes were rushed as if lingering might invite regret. Powerlessness has a specific feeling. It's not loud, it doesn't scream, it hums beneath your skin, reminding you that your life is moving whether you agree with it or not. She didn't cry on the journey, didn't plead, didn't demand answers. Resistance doesn't always look like rebellion. Sometimes it looks like endurance. She told herself one thing, over and over: survive first, decide later. And in that quiet resolve, in that unspoken refusal to disappear inside someone else's decision, something important took root. Because even then, before she ever met him, she knew this truth. Some decisions are made for you before you're old enough to fight back. But survival, that part still belonged to her, and she intended to keep it. Before she ever stepped into his world already had a reputation. Not one built on stories told loudly, but on sentences that ended conversations. He was feared, not because he demanded it, but because fear had learned to arrange itself around him. BR control was his language, discipline his shield. In his world, nothing happened by accident. People didn't act unless they were certain of the outcome. And uncertainty was eliminated early. He trusted no one. Trust required vulnerability, and vulnerability was a cost he had learned never to pay. If you asked the people who worked for him, they would say he was fair, precise, unmoved. They would also say they had never seen him hesitate. He believed he felt nothing, or at least he had convinced himself of it. Feelings complicated decisions. Feelings created gaps, and gaps were where mistakes lived. Love, in particular, was treated like a liability, something that weakened judgment, something that blurred lines, something that got people killed. So he kept his world narrow, predictable, clean. When the offer was brought to him, he didn't ask for details that didn't matter. He didn't ask where she came from, didn't ask what she wanted, didn't ask what she had lost to end up there. Her story wasn't part of the agreement. The terms were clear. The exchange was efficient. The outcome was supposed to be simple. He accepted the deal because it solved a problem, nothing more. To him, she was not a person yet. She was responsibility, an obligation he had agreed to manage, and that was how he preferred things. But even then, before he ever met her, there was a deviation. Small, almost invisible. He insisted on conditions that weren't required, protection that exceeded the agreement, boundaries that suggested, restraint where none had been requested. No one questioned it. They never did. Because questioning him had never led anywhere safe. When she arrived, he observed her the way he observed everything else. Without emotion. Without assumption. He noted her silence, her composure, the absence of desperation. She didn't look at him like someone begging to be spared. She looked at him like someone already planning how to endure. And for reasons he couldn't explain, that unsettled him. She carried emotion in ways that didn't demand attention, in the way she paused before speaking, in the way she noticed exits, in the way she listened more than she talked. She was human, feeling contained, careful, quiet, resilient. He was emotional silence perfected. Where she held tension in her breath, he released none at all. Where she wondered what would happen next, he already knew. Or thought he did. He kept his distance. Not out of cruelty, but out of habit. Distance kept things clear. Distance kept control intact. Yet distance did not erase awareness. He noticed her presence even when she wasn't in the room. The way the house shifted around her. The way routines adapted without instruction. This was not affection. He was certain of that. This was observation. Still, there was a question he never voiced, not even to himself. Why had he agreed so quickly? It wasn't because he needed leverage, he already had it. It wasn't because he owed anyone. He never did. And it wasn't because he cared. At least, not in the way the word usually meant. Somewhere between reason and instinct, he had said yes, and that unexamined choice, that single moment of acceptance, would become the one decision he could never fully explain, because she was never meant to matter. And yet, from the moment she entered his controlled, measured world, the balance began to shift. BR slowly, quietly, without permission. And the question remained, BR, why did a man who trusted no one agree to take responsibility for someone who would eventually ask him to feel everything? The day she arrived, nothing dramatic happened. No shouting, no display of power meant to frighten her into obedience, no reminder of who held control. And that, somehow, was worse. The house was larger than she expected, quiet in a way that felt deliberate, as if sound itself had been trained to behave. She stood where she was placed, hands folded, waiting for instruction. He didn't greet her, he observed. Not openly, not in a way that invited reaction, just enough to learn how she carried herself, how she breathed, how she stood when she thought no one was watching. Rules came first, where she could go, where she could not, who she could speak to, when doors would be locked. There was no warmth in the delivery, but there was no threat either. Just structure. Affection was never offered. Kindness was never implied. Instead, there was space, rooms that felt intentionally distant from his own, schedules that rarely overlapped, a separation that suggested control without closeness. She waited for harm, prepared herself for it. People didn't exchange lives without consequences. She knew that much. But days passed, then more. And nothing happened. No raised voices. No punishment for speaking too slowly or moving too carefully. No demands she hadn't already anticipated. What she received instead was distance so complete it felt like an absence she was meant to fill. He watched her more than he spoke. From doorways, from across rooms, from places she could feel but not see. Never close enough to touch. Never far enough to forget she was there. She noticed things quickly. He never touched her. Not by accident, not in passing. Not even when space forced proximity. And yet, she was protected. Guards adjusted their behavior without explanation. Conversations ended when she approached. The house subtly bent around her safety. Protection without reassurance. Authority without cruelty. It confused her. She had prepared herself to endure pain, not restraint. He noticed things. 2. He noticed she never begged. Not for freedom, not for mercy, not even for answers. She accepted instructions, without submission, followed rules without surrendering herself to them, and she never cried. Not when she was alone, not when she thought someone might hear. Pain, when it came, was swallowed quietly, stored somewhere behind her eyes, controlled. That restraint caught his attention. In his world, people pleaded when they were afraid. They broke. They revealed themselves. She did neither. They moved around each other carefully, like two people aware that one wrong step could change everything. Meals eaten separately. Hallways crossed without conversation. Silence filling spaces where words might have complicated things. Yet the silence wasn't empty. It was watching, waiting. She began to understand something unsettling. She was not being punished. She was being managed. And he began to understand something equally unsettling. She was not afraid of him in the way others were. She respected the boundaries, but she didn't shrink beneath them. Two people trapped in the same house, both prisoners. Just different kinds. She was confined by an agreement she never signed. He was confined by rules he had written himself, and neither of them knew yet that the distance between them, so carefully maintained, was already narrowing. Not through touch. Not through words. But through attention. Because power notices resistance. And silence, when shared, has a way of turning into understanding. And in that house built on control, something subtle began to take shape. Not trust. Not affection. Awareness. The kind that makes distance harder to maintain with every passing day. Nothing announced the change. There was no moment either of them could point to later and say, that's when it started. It happened quietly. The way habits form. The way people begin to matter before they're ever acknowledged. They shared silence long before they shared anything else. That BR, not the awkward kind, not the kind that demanded filling. This silence stayed. It settled between rooms, lingered in hallways, followed them through the house like a presence neither of them named. He began to notice patterns, the times she ate, the way she avoided the windows at night, the hours when she slept lightly, as if rest were something she didn't fully trust. So food started appearing outside her door. No explanation, no announcement, just a tray placed carefully, then footsteps retreating before she could respond. She stared at it the first time for a long while. Suspicion before hunger, habit before comfort, she ate anyway. Not because she trusted him, but because her body reminded her that survival didn't wait for certainty. The next morning, the tray was gone, cleaned, returned, the routine repeated, and slowly, without meaning to, she began to expect it. Expectation was dangerous. She knew that. Another night, colder than the others, she lingered too long in a corridor she wasn't meant to be in. He passed by without stopping, without speaking but later a coat appeared over her shoulders. No hands lingered. No words followed. Just warmth placed where it was needed, then distance restored. She stood there for a moment, confused by the sudden weight of it. Protection without permission. Care without claim. It unsettled her more than cruelty ever could have. Because cruelty made it easy to resist. Safety did not. She started to feel it in small ways. The way her shoulders relaxed when she heard his footsteps. The way she stopped flinching at unexpected sounds. The way the house no longer felt like it was waiting to close in on her. And she hated herself for that. Hated the ease, hated the relief, hated the fragile comfort blooming where fear used to live. Attachment had never protected her before. Attachment had been the thing that made loss unbearable. So she kept her distance, even as she accepted the quiet kindnesses. She told herself this was temporary, that safety was not affection, that calm was not love. He told himself something else, that none of this meant anything, that noticing her routines was simply efficiency, that ensuring her comfort maintained order, that the quiet concern tightening his chest was irritation, nothing more. He denied it even as his actions contradicted him. He altered schedules so their paths wouldn't cross too often, then found himself lingering when they did. He avoided conversation, then listened for her movements when she wasn't nearby. Vulnerability was a risk he had eliminated from his life long ago. He had watched it ruin men stronger than him, smarter than him. So he told himself he was still in control, yet control had begun to look different. It looked like restraint, like hesitation, like choices made for reasons he didn't examine too closely. She noticed the way he never entered her space without warning, the way instructions softened without becoming kind, the way his presence no longer felt like something she had to endure. And that frightened her, because safety, when it comes quietly, has a way of inviting hope. She didn't want hope. Hope made you stay. Hope made you wait. Hope made leaving harder than arriving. They continued this way for weeks, two people orbiting each other, close enough to feel the pull, far enough to deny it existed. No confessions, no promises. Just a growing awareness that something essential was being shared without permission or language. She feared attachment because attachment had always come with a cost. He feared vulnerability because vulnerability dismantled the walls that had kept him alive. And somewhere between shared silence and silent care, a question lingered, unasked, unanswered. Is safety the same as love? Neither of them knew. But both of them were beginning to understand that once safety enters a life shaped by fear, nothing ever feels simple again. For weeks, the quiet had been their language. A language built on observation, restraint, and careful routines. She had begun to feel something she didn't want to name. And he had begun to feel something he refused to admit. But peace is fragile. Fragile in a house built on agreements instead of love. It happened one evening. A conversation she wasn't meant to hear. Words spoken in low tones through walls she didn't realize were thin. And in those words she heard her fate unravel. He was planning to move her. Not for harm, not for punishment, not for revenge. But to her ears it sounded like abandonment, discarded, exchanged once again. Her stomach dropped, her chest tightened. Every lesson she had learned about endurance and survival collapsed into a single raw thought. They're giving me away. The walls she had built around herself snapped inward. Her silence turned inward. Her eyes stopped observing. Her voice stopped forming words. Her emotions became a private prison she refused to share. She shut down. No explanation, no confrontation, just withdrawal. A retreat into herself. He noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed the way her movement slowed, the way her eyes no longer met his, the way she no longer expected anything. And for a moment he felt the stirrings of something dangerous, concern. Dangerous because it threatened the rules he had lived by. Rules that said to control emotion, to never let attachment root, to maintain distance. So he responded the only way he knew how. He became colder. Not out of malice, not out of anger, but deliberately, purposely, calculated, to protect her. He believed that distance would shield her, that removing himself emotionally would prevent her from being hurt, that isolation might make her safer than any kindness could. And she believed he had abandoned her, that she had never mattered, that her presence had been another transaction, another agreement in a life she hadn't chosen. Neither of them understood, at least not yet, that their actions were mirror images of care, distorted by fear. She refused to speak. He refused to soften, both believing they were acting for the other's good. The house grew colder. Rooms expanded with silence. Hallways echoed with unspoken words. Small gestures disappeared. Meals appeared and vanished without acknowledgement. Steps that once lingered now passed quickly, measured, precise, distant. And in the midst of it, the unspoken question hovered like smoke between them. Who will break first? Because breaking wasn't weakness. Not here, not now. Breaking was survival. It was acknowledgement that the person on the other side of fear might actually care. She feared attachment. He feared vulnerability. And yet, they were both reaching for each other in the only way they knew how, pushing away. It became a tense rhythm, a dance neither taught nor agreed upon. Every glance avoided, every word withheld, every distance maintained. And all the while their hearts were entangled, because sometimes the greatest protection is not in holding someone close, but in giving them space to survive. And sometimes the greatest danger of all lies in loving quietly, without confession, while the other believes they have already lost. This was their conflict. Two people trying to protect each other, by pushing each other away, by making the other believe they were alone, and neither realizing that distance could never keep two hearts apart once they had begun to notice each other. The day she made her decision, the house felt heavier, not louder, not violent, just quiet in a way that pressed against the walls, against the ceilings, against her chest. She packed slowly. Not with fear, not with panic, not with hope. She packed with purpose. For the first time since this life began, she was acting for herself, not for survival, not for obedience, not for anyone else's expectations. She wasn't leaving to escape him. She wasn't running from fear or rules or agreements made on her behalf. She was leaving to reclaim herself. The realization had come gradually, in quiet moments and small observations, in the space between his careful distance and her own endurance, in the small kindnesses that had no names, in the long silent corridors where she had learned she could breathe. She understood finally that freedom wasn't given, it wasn't offered, it was taken, and taking it meant leaving before anything else could define her. Meanwhile, he was unaware, oblivious, wrapped up in his own assumptions that she was still a piece of the deal, a variable to be managed, controlled, contained. He never considered she might choose. He never considered she might see herself as more than an obligation, more than collateral, and in that moment of realization he understood too late. She was never the deal. She was the risk he had never signed up for, the risk that had crept into his ordered world, the risk that challenged every rule he had lived by, every boundary he had built around his heart. He watched her gather her things, watched her move quietly, efficiently, with dignity intact. He did not speak. He did not intervene. He could not, because to intervene would undo her choice. And he understood, in a way that terrified him, that some things were larger than his control. The goodbye came without anger. No shouting, no frantic pleading, no desperate confessions. It came in silence. She left the room. He remained, the air between them. Heavy, but unbroken. There were no words, no declarations of love, no promises to chase her down, just acceptance. And in that acceptance, everything changed, because sometimes silence speaks louder than confession. Sometimes walking away demonstrates courage more profoundly than staying. As she disappeared down the corridors, he realized how little he had understood, how blind he had been to the humanity in front of him, how much he had underestimated the one thing he could never control: her choice. And for the first time in years, he felt the vulnerability he had worked so hard to avoid, a hollow ache in his chest, a tension he could not command, a question he could not answer. How had he allowed himself to care? Because she had always mattered. More than a deal, more than a transaction, more than rules could contain. And she had reminded him, in the quietest, most unintentional ways, that risk was never the enemy. Attachment was never weakness. Love was never optional. But she had left before he could say it, before he could justify it, before he could make it safe, and he could only watch and wait and feel the weight of what he had never understood, that sometimes the most dangerous choice of all is letting someone go even when you would rather hold on, because control had no power over the heart, and he was only beginning to realize that some losses were inevitable, even when love had arrived, and in the silence she left behind, he understood something crucial. She was never meant to be tamed. She was never meant to belong to him. She was meant to awaken him, and he didn't know whether he had the courage to follow her, or the strength to stay behind. After she left, the house felt emptier than it had ever been. Rooms that had been alive with careful routines were now silent in a way that made him uneasy. At first, he tried to convince himself it was fine, that the rules had been followed, that agreements had been upheld, that she was safe, but it was a lie he could no longer maintain, because what had shifted wasn't outside him, it was inside. Control, the one thing he had always held like a shield, was slipping. Not the control over his empire, his men, or his resources. No, that remained intact. He could still move armies with a glance, still make decisions that bent reality to his will. But he had lost control over himself. Thoughts of her crept in at odd moments, in the middle of meetings, when his meals arrived too hot or too cold. Even in sleep, she haunted the quiet corners of his mind, her presence impossible to ignore. He replayed her expressions, the way she stood when no one was watching, the way she carried her pride quietly, even when it should have been easier to break, the small, defiant grace in her movements, that made him realize, painfully, that owning her had always been the simplest thing he could do, but choosing her freedom, that was something else entirely, that required courage, humility, a willingness to surrender the illusion of control he had spent decades perfecting. He understood, in a way he had never understood anything before, that love does not ask to be kept, it does not demand possession, it does not bow to contracts, rules, or fear. Love asks to be chosen, every day, every decision, every act of restraint. And he realized that choosing her freedom was the hardest decision he would ever make, because it meant acknowledging her strength, her autonomy, her power to define her own life. It meant putting himself second. It meant seeing her as more than something to manage, more than someone to protect, more than a responsibility or an arrangement. And yet, he couldn't stop himself from imagining the alternative. What if he had refused her the choice? What if he had stepped forward, demanded her presence, ignored her agency, ignored the life she had begun to reclaim? The thought made his chest tighten, a knot of shame, regret, and longing he had never learned to name. He saw the consequences clearly. Owning her would have been easy. Choosing her, truly, freely, was dangerous. Dangerous because it required vulnerability. Dangerous because it required humility. Dangerous because it meant risking the one thing he had spent his life guarding, himself. And he realized something else, quietly, painfully. She had already changed him. The walls he had built around his heart were no longer sufficient. The distance he had relied upon was now a barrier he no longer wanted. And the safety he had maintained had been meaningless if it could not coexist with her freedom. He could not undo what had happened. He could not control it, but he could decide. And that decision, whether to fight for her or let her walk away completely, was no longer a matter of power. It was a matter of love. A love that demanded choice. A love that demanded risk. A love that demanded the courage to be vulnerable. In a world where he had always believed vulnerability was weakness, the question now hung between them, unspoken, unavoidable. Would he let her go, or fight the world for her? Because in this house built on agreements, fear, and distance, he had discovered a truth he had never known. The most dangerous, the most transformative force in his life was not control. It was love. And love does not submit. It does not negotiate. It only asks one thing: to be chosen, every time. She walked toward the door one last time, her bag light, her shoulders straighter than they had ever been. He watched her from across the room. No words, no pleas, no dramatic gestures, just the weight of realization settling between them. He had long since understood that owning her was never the answer. Possession was simple, control was easy, but it was meaningless, and meaning was all she deserved. So he did the only thing he could. He helped her disappear, quietly, completely, without conditions, without expectation, without trying to rewrite the rules that had always governed her life. He arranged it so that she could leave safely, without anyone tracing her steps, without leaving breadcrumbs of her existence behind. It was a careful, deliberate act, as precise as any of his other operations, but carried out with something new: care. Care without ownership. She left that house stronger than she had arrived. No fear in her voice, no doubt in her steps, no debt owed to anyone but herself. And he stayed behind. Silent, disciplined, observing the space she had vacated and noticing, for the first time, the emptiness that was not just in the room, but in himself. They did not speak, they did not promise, they did not chase. Love was not about capture, love was not about possession. Love, he learned, was letting someone choose their own path and honoring that choice even when it hurt more than any betrayal ever could. And in that silence, something bittersweet settled over him. He had given her the greatest gift he could offer: freedom. And in doing so, he realized the truth of the world he had never fully accepted. Love exists, but it does not bind, it does not control, it does not demand. It watches, it waits, it allows growth, it allows strength, it allows the other person to become who they were meant to be. She would leave and never return, not because she didn't care, but because she was whole now. And he would remain, changed, weaker in some ways perhaps, but infinitely richer in understanding, because some love stories do not end with possession. Some end with respect. And that respect, that bittersweet acknowledgement of what had been shared, was a kind of love in itself. It lingered in the quiet rooms. It lingered in the empty hallways. It lingered in the careful routines he maintained, even as he had lost the one presence that had changed everything. And somewhere far away she would carry it too. The memory of a man who didn't own her, who didn't demand her presence, but who had, in letting her go, shown her exactly what love could be. Because love isn't proven by possession. It isn't measured by control. It is proven in the respect to let someone be free. And that, he realized, was the most dangerous, most transformative, most enduring kind of love of all. Some love stories are not written in kisses, or confessions shouted across rooms, or desperate attempts to hold on. Some love stories are quieter than that, more complicated, more human. They are about choice, about the courage to step back, to let someone walk away, to honor the life they want to lead even if it hurts more than anything else. Love is not ownership, it is not possession, it is not control. Love is the willingness to see someone as they are, not as you want them to be. And healing doesn't always look like staying. It doesn't always look like forgiveness. It doesn't always look like reunion. Sometimes healing looks like freedom. Sometimes healing looks like distance. Sometimes healing looks like letting go and trusting that what was shared has changed both of you forever. She learned that strength comes from choice, from reclaiming agency over her life, from understanding that love is not a chain but a chance to grow. He learned that vulnerability is not weakness, that caring does not make you soft, and that letting go can be the truest measure of love. And the world moves on, but their story lingers in the quiet spaces, in the rooms where silence once lived, in the pauses where words were never spoken, in the acts of care given without expectation. Because that is what love really is, not what we take, but what we give freely. And now, for you, have you ever loved someone enough to let them go? Have you ever realized that holding on might hurt more than stepping back? Do you believe love is proven by choice or by possession? Some stories end with freedom, some stories end with reunion, but every story asks the same question: are you brave enough to love without owning? And now, as her footsteps fade into the distance, as the house returns to its quiet rhythms, and as he stands among the echoes of what once was, we are left with the questions that no one can answer for them. Should she have stayed, or was leaving the bravest thing she ever did? Can love exist where power once lived, where walls were built to control, and fear was the currency of every interaction? Have you ever walked away from something that loved you, because it wasn't safe, because that is what this story teaches. Love is not about possession. It is not about fear. It is not about what others demand of you. Love is about choice. Choice that is sometimes painful. Choice that is sometimes silent. Choice that can break your heart while saving your soul. And so, we leave it to you. Tell me what you think. This story ends differently, depending on who's watching. Some will see courage in her departure. Some will see loss in his silence. Some will see love that lingers quietly, even when it is unspoken, even when it cannot be claimed. Because stories like this, slow burn, painful, real, aren't about closure, they're about reflection, and the choices we make when love and freedom collide. So, I ask you again, what would you have done? Would you have stayed or walked away? The answer might surprise you, the answer might hurt, but it will always be yours. And that, in the end, is the lesson. Some love stories aren't about romance. They're about courage. They're about choice. They're about learning when holding on is no longer love, and when letting go becomes the most powerful act of all. If this story gripped you, tap like and subscribe for more unforgettable stories that will keep you hooked.